As I mentioned before, one important part of animation is actually being able to control how the animations change from one to another by using scripts. So, as we have seen before, this is the typical aspect of an animation controller, animator controller, when you have different states and different transitions between them, and you have different parameters, right? So in this case, we have several transitions like idle, run, and jump, and different parameters. In this case, it's the float value for speed, float value for direction, and two triggers, the jump trigger and the high trigger, right? And then imagine that we have configured, or we want to configure these transitions. So we want to go from idle to run with this speed value is higher than 0.1. Back from run to idle when this speed is less than 0.1. From run, we want to go to jump when the jump trigger is set to true, and from jump back to run when you have an exit time. Okay, essentially is when basically says when the jump animation has finished, which happens at 0.9 of the actual animation clip, it will automatically go back to run. Okay, so how could you do this in terms of code? This is an example that shows how to do this by a script. So one thing that is quite important in Animator is this string to hash. So in order to be able to access the name of the parameters, in order to access particular states, so you have this function called animator.string to hash where you pass the name. This is the full name of the parameter or of the layer dot the name of the state, and that allows you to have an ID, an identifier for these parameters and these states. Okay. Of course, this is an animator controller, so you can have a reference to it that you get the component in the classical way. So you need all these things to be able to modify these parameters. And then in the update function, what you are always doing is the following. So first, you can get the information about the state. This is stored in this struct called state info. And then you can essentially check, for instance, if you are in a state called run and you get your input fire equals to 1, sorry, to fire 1 is actually pressed, the button is pressed, then what you do is just use this function called set boolean. This jump hash is set to true, right? And that is what is going to make that if you are running, it's just going to modify this parameter, this transition, so it's going to be able to move from this state to this state further down. Okay, so essentially it just says this jump hash. Jump hash is the parameter jump over here, right? If you are not in running, this should never be true, right? Because we only want to capture this jump hash trigger, set it to true when you are in running and pressing the button fire. So in general, when you are not in this state, when the state machine is not in the state run, we can just set this to false. Okay, this is another part of the code that plays a high animation. So imagine you have another button that you want to capture. So when you play this button, you are going to be playing an animation high that allows you to do some sort of movement with only one hand, right? This is an example of when you are using different layers. So in this case, it's just double checking that you actually have at least 2 layers. Because you have the other layer is going to be playing this hand waving animation. So you could have another parameter here called high hash that comes from this parameter high. And essentially what it's doing is just setting this value to the opposite of the actual value, right? So the way this actually has a behavior, which is every time you press this button, the one that is mapped to fire 2, you would start the wave animation, or if the animation is already started, then you're essentially gonna stop it just by toggling between the values true, false, every time the button is fire 2 is pressed. And finally, what we're gonna have here is taking 2 different values, so H and V for the movement. We have seen this before, and we can just set the parameters for these particular values to the hash themselves. So you have the animator, you have the parameter speed. Remember that this comes from here. So you just calculate the speed that this input is providing to the player, and this is going to be a value, a float value that's going to be set into the speed hash. And remember that if you have this value set to 1, so when you are in idle, you move to run when this value is greater than 1. So you would essentially be setting the value here, and if this value is greater than 1, the finite state machine will be automatically transitioning to another state, which in this case is the one for running. There is a lot of information in the actual animation class, and we have seen animator state info as a way to get information about the current state information. You can also get information about the transition. So transition might take some time to actually happen, so you can actually get the information about the transition and find out how the transition is going. There's a lot of it's a huge API for animations. You can check the main classes. There are more than these ones, but you have a class animator and you have two structs for the state and the transition information. You can follow these links and find out more about what sort of parameters you can access when you're playing with animations.